So the problem I want to discuss here is the administrative state and discretion, which we had some discussion earlier. And if you've got your sort of sociology of knowledge radar on, you'll notice that there are a few sociologists now writing in defense of the administrative state, which is sort of the most unloved part of government. Nobody likes bureaucracy. And so the fact that we're getting defenses of this is pretty interesting. But there's a political reason, a motivation behind this. And what I want to do is try to strip down a bunch of concepts to show you what this is really about and how it connects up with the sort of traditional ideas about the nature of democracy and the nature of modern governance. So I'm going to start out with some basic Schmidt here. Modern constitutions, especially in Europe, are mixed constitutional forms. They involve different sources of legitimacy, and so in your civics lesson version of this, these all reduce to things like constitutions and ideas like parliamentary sovereignty, which reduce everything to one particular locus of original power or sovereignty. But in reality, these states are mixed up versions of things that are inherited from the past or overlaid by reforms that bring in different principles of legitimacy, and they still operate in that way. So the administrative state is the classic example of this because it's the residual administrative or bureaucratic and legal leftover of absolutism that never really goes away. So and throughout all of these European revolutions, the bureaucracy goes on and it has its own legitimacy. So people respect it, people even revere bureaucrats, and the state has, especially in Germany, a kind of mystical significance that doesn't have anything to do with sort of the democratic roots of anything. Okay, this is something that Schmidt was very sensitive to, and it actually has a very peculiar relation to American politics, which is kind of where I'm going with this. But so I'm going to give you sort of a basic picture of the skeletal concepts here. And if I had a fancy guy to do graphics here, I'd put all kinds of arrows between these things. But the thing I want to focus on is the idea of the first three bullet points, and the idea of democracy in relation to administration and legislation. So my concepts here are basically, the Kelsenian ones. That democracy means the rule of the people, and the rule of the people can be expressed in multiple ways. It doesn't have to be constitutional, and Schmidt saw this as basically acclamation was the sort of the purest form of democracy. But we're accustomed to seeing it in legal forms. So Kelsen is concerned with the various kinds of legal forms of representation. So once you get to that kind of legal structure, you end up with typically a parliament or a legislature, and it tends to be organized around parties. And the parties then decide what it is that politics is about. They determine the domain of politics by what it is that they choose to legislate about. And so one of the important features of this is that they choose not to legislate about lots of things. And one of the easiest solutions to political problems for parties is to leave those problems to the administration, to which has all kinds of powers, which in theory are authorized by either the Constitution or the legislature, but there's this magic thing of discretion which allows them to do things that they decide are justified without much control by either the people or the legislature. So this is then the source of lots of friction in the system, and it's especially evident today when you've got so-called populist movements which object both to what the legislature and the parties are doing and what they're failing to do in controlling the administration. So one of the really interesting things about the recent French popular movement has been that Macron has said, well, maybe we should abolish INA, the School of Administration. Now, that is very acute because that's exactly what the people were objecting to, being ruled by these high-level bureaucrats who weren't accountable to anybody. But this turns out to be a common problematic and theme. So it's as though in normal politics, the administration goes along, uses its discretion, gets away with it, people are more or less satisfied, and the political parties don't interfere with it, and define their own issues to compete with one another. And then, and the people may be, more or less dissatisfied with this. They're not dissatisfied enough to go to the streets or to start an alternative movement or to try to force their issues into the domain of public discussion. But when that breaks down, when the people don't get heard, then they act. And sometimes they try to start political parties, other times they just protest, sometimes they find search for a leader who will demand reforms. And those are the things that generally get called populist. So let's make a distinction here between populist and other kinds of things. Harvey Mansfield has this wonderful discussion of populism where he says, well, populism is the belief in the superior virtue of the people, the virtue in the broadest sense, including wisdom. So that alerts you right away. It's not the experts. It's in the wisdom is in the people. And this is one justification for democracy. Why do we have democracy? Because the people have superior wisdom. That wasn't, say, Kelson's. Kelson's was about freedom. If you have majoritarian rule, at least the majority won't oppress itself. That's a pretty minimal justification for democracy, but it's totally free of any assertion of the wisdom of the people. It's just straight about freedom. But it's worth keeping in mind this issue of where the wisdom resides and the close relationship, but not complete overlap between the notion of democracy and this notion of populism. Okay, so the EU is another example of one of these cases where we've got a high-level administration, we've got a parliament that's pretty ineffective and organized around parties and so on. They define the issues, life goes on, and so on, and the people are pretty much left out of this process. So if they're lucky, they can squeeze their way into parliament, and then they're really lucky somebody up on the top will listen to them. Excuse me. Okay, so the normal sort of legalistic conception of democracy is one in which there are clear principles of how you do elections, what representation is, and so on and so forth. And so that's the basic role of constitutions. This other relationship, so that's the relationship between the third bullet and the second, But the one between the administration and Parliament is much less clear because it's not enforceable. The other one is enforceable by elections. You have democratic accountability, people vote, and if you don't like your representative, you get rid of your representative. You don't have that kind of enforcement in relation to administration, and because of the fact of administrative discretion, which we'll talk more about. But one of the ways in which there is enforcement is the existence of courts which govern sometimes administration. So the French have one of these courts that anybody can go to and complain about the administration, but it doesn't really constrain it that much. The U.S. is a very much more complicated situation where legally administration is not allowed to make law. It's not constitutional. But through various fictions, it's been allowed to do that and make sort of quasi-law. So if you have something like airline regulations, those have the force of law, but they're only law in the sense that you voluntarily enter into the domain of this excuse me, activity by flying airplanes, which has to be licensed and so on and so forth. So it's like the FAA is never going to speak to me because I don't fly any airplanes. So it's not a general law. But it's nevertheless, it turns out that about 28 times as many regulations are produced by the administration than are produced by the legislator. So the legislator makes laws, the administration really makes laws in massive quantities, but they don't they don't have quite the same legal significance. So the courts have a role, theoretically, in pruning this stuff and correcting it, but through a series of decisions and practices, like the notion of standing, they've withdrawn more or less from this arena. So there's a lot of administrative discretion, and it's very difficult to either control it legislatively or legally. And this may be sort of intrinsic to the modern state. Okay, so this is all background. There's obviously a big discourse today about threats to democracy, and I think at the moment, I think there are two ways that people talk about threats to democracy. Usually when the talk comes from the left is usually pretty vague, but basically what it means is the threat against the power of the state. The idea is that the people control the state acts on their behalf, and if you restrict that power, you are restricting democracy. And a lot of this has to do with neoliberalism and the use of sort of constitutional and legal controls to limit state power, which is anti-democratic in the sense of limiting the power, therefore, of the people. So we get into more of this later. So this, there's a kind of fear of neoliberalism, and it's rooted in this understanding of neoliberalism as the politically sanctioned abandonment of the power of the state to protect people from the undesirable outcomes of the market and to bring about social justice. So so that's, if you read somebody like Nancy MacLean, who's got this book on Buchanan and the Koch brothers, this is kind of what she thinks is a threat to democracy. So what's sort of paradoxical here is that the exercise of democratic power through the administrative state actually works to undermine democratic power itself. because the power is the discretionary power of bureaucrats. And so it amounts to actually handing powers over to bureaucrats who have a lot of discretion in how to use it. And this whole problematic, it's a big problem for liberalism in the sense of liberal democracy, because if we think of liberal democracy as government by discussion, this assumes that there are more or less direct effects of those democratic decisions. There's informed feedback and so on and so forth. And this is a story that works really well for legislatures, but not at all for the administrative state. The administrative state mystifies and obscures the process of decision. Bureaucratic secrecy is the norm, and it substitutes its own expertise and its own processes for democratic discussion. Now we're going to see some people justifying this in a moment. Okay, so what's discretion? There's a long Viennese discussion of this problem. Excuse me, but the basic ideas are really contained in Kelson's discussion of legal interpretation. And his argument is that laws are, legislation is ambiguous. When people make general laws, there are ambiguities. And those have a legal meaning. They are a kind of delegation of authority to whoever it is that's carrying out that law. They get to choose how to interpret in the face of this ambiguity. And this is the case for law, straight legislation, but the same principle applies to administration. And this really leads to some remarkable results. So the laws in the U.S. are mostly, as I've said, produced by regulation, and this is all done through administration, which and it's actually it is an incredibly complicated problem. So if you're in a university and if you've got want to do a research project, you're subject to a law passed by Congress. But if you read the law passed by Congress, you would never figure out that why it is that you're going through the administrative procedures you're going through, because it's gone through this multiple series of interpretations which constrain each party, including the university, which is given the job of self-regulation, but that self-regulation is approved by a bureaucracy. So you end up with this huge body of things like institutional research boards that tell you literally what kind of questions you could put in the questionnaire, what kind of research methods you could use. And you would think, well, gee, did Congress say anything about that? Well, not really. No, they said something about ethics. And then all of a sudden it was reinterpreted by the bureaucracy to mean all these things, and every place down the road, within the range of this ambiguity, created their own regulations. Okay, and this is even the tip of the iceberg of how regulation works. Not only do they write regulations to tell you to write regulations, they give advice which tells you, well, behave in a certain way, and we won't sue you. But we won't tell you exactly what the rules here are. And we're not telling you you have to do this. We're just telling you do it our way, and then we won't hassle you. And this is, and it turns out there's a long history of this kind of administrative bullying that is part of this process. Okay, so this is not surprisingly, there's a large literature, and it's been a basic problem in liberal thought, and it's usually in form of discussions of the rule of law. So the problem of the administrative state in Albert Van Beese's classic account of this is that what's necessary for the administrative state to be governed by the common courts, not by its own courts, not by the legislature, but the common courts. And the idea there is that that can hold the bureaucracy to the law. But there are many more issues here. So the bureaucracies themselves tend to distinguish between input and output legitimacy, the procedural legitimacy that justifies a law, and the results legitimacy that justifies their discretion. And this raises the whole question of whether you can really have a democratic liberal state in the face of the complexity and the need for expertise of the modern state. Can this stuff be subject to public discussion, or do you just have to hand it off to administrators and then just be more or less happy with the outcomes? Yeah. So, okay, so the liberal, or sort of the classically liberal solutions to this problem are, well, you have to constrain the state either legislatively or constitutionally. You have to assert a realm of rights against the state, and including those that facilitate government by discussion, like free speech rights. And you have to rely on judicial constraints on the state and on legal challenges to the state by citizens. Okay, this is a classical but not very effective solution. So that's sort of the right version of this. And you see this in German legal thinking of the 19th century, where the bourgeoisie wanted the Rechtsstaat because this is a way of constraining the state and wanted to rely on the courts, didn't really trust the people as a traditional German problem, fear of the people. And so they believed in the courts. And Kelsen was interesting because he rejected that view. He said, no, the only real protection for democracy and freedom has got to be in the electorate itself. So on the roughly the left, and we're now just talking about Pettit and Philip Pettit and Habermas here, there's sort of two different solutions to this. They acknowledge the problem, but they reject this kind of liberal control of the state by asserting rights and having it enforced by the courts. He is against what Riker says, the idea that constraining the state through electoral processes is populist and therefore democratic. He's against that. We'll get back to that. And he's also against the liberal way of constraining the constraint by the courts. His alternative is that the relevant power is to impose community-wide standards on how the government forms its decision and what it actually decides. So this is going to be a constraint on decision. Now he's famous for this idea of common knowledge, and that there's a kind of moral significance to the general normative standards that people have, especially in relation to the idea of domination. So people choose what counts as domination, but they don't choose it democratically. There's a kind of common sense of what it is, and that's the baseline for human freedom, which is not really human freedom for him anymore. It's he wants to get rid of that liberal language and replace it with the freedom from domination. So these community-wide standards, then, there's something he believes actually exist, and he says that this can be enacted by what he calls contestatory vigilance. directly rather than through the courts or through elections. Now, how that would work is difficult to say, but this is the line he has. The idea is that people have some kind of control under these unelected, unaccountable personnel. And and the control is something like moral suasion. So these people, this is really kind of a denial of the problem of discretion. What he wants to say is, yes, they have the discretion, that's a good thing, but they behave in such a way that comports with the correct ideas of the community in general, so we don't need these other constraints. They're going to behave on their own. We can trust them. Okay. And so a lot of these officials that he's talking about are the courts, ombudsmen, and so forth, are themselves people who are constraining the state, and it includes things like independent officials and bodies that monitor things and evaluate things like auditors and solicitors, and also things that are like mediation bodies. So he's fascinated with the idea that we can take things out of the political arena and hand it into some kind of expert arena and solve things that way. So when he talks about tie-breaking constraints that ensure that decisions between equally acceptable policies are not indefinitely delayed, this turns out to be a big problem in this literature, efficiency and delay. They're made by procedures that fit with common concerns. So this might be a committee vote or a referendum or referral to an expert or impartial body. So these are actually quite different things. A referendum is as close to pure democracy as you get, but referral to an expert or impartial body is outsourcing decision-making to experts. There's an interesting literature developing on this. John Elster has a book on this in 2013, where he interprets this and juries and all kinds of bodies like this as protections against misrule rather than as kind of legislative bodies. But Pettit takes them to be the means of the expression of some kind of common civic culture. And there's a prehistory of this in the American public administration literature, which has to do with the idea that public administrators have a kind of direct democratic mandate and responsibility apart from anything that's in the legislation or in the courts. Okay, so where does this stuff come from? Interestingly enough, it's first formulated by Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is usually not, it was so consequential for other things, we sort of ignore the fact that he was a professor of politics, and his successor at Bryn Mawr was Franklin Giddings, the founding sociologist of American statistical sociology. And so he was an academic, and he gives a pretty well-developed account of what the proper relations here are. And it's an account that is basically critical of existing American democracy. He's very hostile to existing American democracy, thought it was no longer relevant and needed to be replaced by something much more European. For him, the issue was to create the conditions of trustfulness so administrators could exercise their discretion and in order to bring about efficient outcomes. So his buzzword was efficiency. But what he really thought was that electoral control of officials was a terrible thing. It led to inefficiency and corruption. And what was necessary was to take as many elective offices out of electoral control as possible and put them into the category of civil service and grant these people discretionary power, unhampered discretion, and then to hope that they were responsible or to trust them. And now, so that's part of the story. The other part of the story that's also kind of roughly the left story, because it ends up with Habermas, is to alter the conditions under which people do government by discussion. So for them, all this untrammeled discussion was not a good thing because it failed to elevate the correct opinions, especially expert opinions. And what was necessary was for what Wilson called opinion leadership. And Wilson's own version of this, written at a time when Britain did not have full suffrage, what he admired was the British, because they had an aristocracy that could tell people how to think. And that's what he wanted in the US. That if you had that, you wouldn't have the problem of all these people running around mouthing their opinions and getting in the way of good government. So by the time this goes through Lippmann and then through Habermas, the idea is that, well, yes, there should be discussion, but it's got to be responsible discussion. The only place that can really happen is a kind of enlightened press. So let's sort of reserve the role of democratic discussion to this body of enlightened people, and then they can shape opinions, and then people can use these opinions to legitimate whatever the state does. Okay, so for Wilson, the first step of doing this is to get rid of elective offices. So get rid of as much literal democratic control as possible. And he's got a long list here of the evils of this. And this is basically the same viewpoint that you find in people like Bryce, and also it's the sort of European view of American democracy of the 19th century. It's got machine politics, it's chaotic, and voters of every blood and environment and social derivation mix and stare at one another at the same voting places. This turns out to be one of his big issues. And his idea is that if you don't have a unified population, if you have a heterogeneous population, you can't really have democracy. Democracy is just like Schmidt. Democracy presupposes a unified people. So he says this no longer exists in the US. This is 1887. So the idea of democracy is the will of the people can only be a fiction that benefits the wrong people. So the solution is centralization, eliminating elective offices in favor of a kind of professionalized administration. And this is always framed in Wilson, and we see this becomes a trope in the later literature, this is saving democracy. So the idea is that we're going to save democracy by getting rid of as much democracy as possible. Okay, so the issue here, as it gets discussed ad nauseum in the subsequent literature on public administration, is that there isn't really a good means of ensuring that the acts of administrative officers shall be consistent not only with the law, but equally with the purposes and tempers of the mass of citizens. So somebody like Pettit thinks, oh, well, there is this mysterious mechanism out here that makes them conform, but nobody else thought that. They obsessed with the problem, and they also noted that there was an intrinsic conflict between public opinion and the attitudes of what White here calls, Leonard White, the highest type of official. So these are going to be enlightened people. The public isn't enlightened, and there's always going to be kind of chafing here that happens between those enlightened officials and experts and the public. Okay, so Wilson's account of this is, and this is again very early, 1887, that, well, the public opinion should play the role of the authoritative critic, but how do you make that authority tell? And he says, our mistake has been to make this a matter of voting. And he says that self-government doesn't consist in having a hand in anything, in everything, any more than housekeeping consists necessarily in cooking dinner with one's own hands. The cook must be trusted with a large discretion as to the management of the fires of the oven. So this is an argument for discretion, and it doesn't give the answer to what plays the part of the authoritative critic. There isn't a good solution to this kind of thing. But the bad solution is the rule of law. So the thing that they wanted to make sure didn't happen was that the lawyers got their hands on the administrative process, and this is, he says, no longer an effective means. It's no longer an effective means, but actually it was too effective as a means, because lawyers could get in and get the courts to intervene in these processes, and what he wanted was to make sure that they couldn't, and that was something that the administrative state was ultimately highly successful in doing. Okay, but this, why is this necessary to do all of this discretion, the creation of this new forms of discretion? This is the guy Thatch is one of the many theorists of public administration at this time, so he's writing during the Roosevelt administration. And his argument, just like Wilson's so many years earlier, is that action is demanded. We can't afford the luxury of the law's delay. We can't afford the luxury of the rule of law. We need to act immediately, and the only way that that can be done is through these grants of substantial discretion. Okay, so why is this protecting democracy from itself? Well, because these things need to be done, and if people are unwilling to elect the people who will make it happen, it's got to happen some other way. And if we allow there to be too much democracy, too much electoral control of officials, these things aren't going to happen. And so democracy in that sense is a threat to democracy in the sense of output legitimacy that's presumably for the benefit of the people. But during this whole discussion, there are constant professions of anxiety that what this really amounted to was the elimination of democracy. And there's a lot of discussion on the education of public administrators and the sort of natural characteristics and temper of public administrators, and how undemocratic they are and how hostile they are to the idea of politics. So they see anything that gets in their way as politics and therefore a bad thing, and their respect for democracy was pretty limited. So there was always trying to say, well, you know, maybe we should do a better job in explaining to our students what democracy is all about, because they don't get it. Okay, so we're back to this problem of ensuring that administrative officers' acts should be consistent with the law. So what is the mechanism that replaces voting? It's simply not an answered question. But there are lots of issues here that, with a long history of administrative officials using their discretion to bully other people into either not objecting to what they're doing, or to intervening in the political process to bring about the kind of silencing and support that they want. This itself is fascinating literature, but it's something that appears constantly in present discussions. So there's a new law review article on this in the Notre Dame Law Review, which talks about freedom of speech issues and gives all of these different cases where administrative agencies have tried to intimidate people by threats of various kinds, just for objecting to what the agency did. And since they have the powers to do this, they have these discretionary powers, they use it. And so this author's solution is, well, let's create an office to regulate this, which is piling bureaucracy on bureaucracy. It's not a very good solution, but the idea was that if you had an office that went to people and said, no, you really can't do that, that would be sufficient for protecting people's freedom of speech. Okay, so what do we get here? And we're just the sort of political theory side of it. What's the sociology here? Well, by the 30s, people in the U.S. Public administration here are openly talking about, well, you know, maybe we need a ruling class, and gee, maybe we should be the ruling class. We're the enlightened people, and this just follows more or less directly from Wilson's original idea of opinion leadership, that some people are enlightened, they need to tell everybody else what to do, and they have to also have the power to bring about what they want without consulting the people who are just going to get in the way. So what this does is create a class, and as Schmidt says, an elite that's capable of producing legitimacy and authority. A professional cadre that creates stability and is entrusted with the guarantee of public interest. So this is going to be a class of bureaucrats that has its own source of legitimacy. So if we go back to the original issue of mixed constitutional forms, the professional civil service is its own form of government, completely separate from democracy or the rule of law, and getting its legitimacy from its guarantee of the public interest. People say, well, that they're on our side and taking care of us, and we'll let them do what they want to do. So this is really a complete anti-democratic ideology. The whole ideology of the administrative itself is coherent. It's a justification of a kind of elite rule, and in the name of saving democracy, but democracy where there's now democracy more or less in name only, but you can see exactly why people would believe that the administrative state in this form is an absolute necessity in modern times. So it's the real antithesis of this form of rule is populism. So it's an assertion of the stupidity of the people, not their virtue. And populism is an assertion of the virtues of the superior virtues of the people. And so populism sort of breaks out whenever this output legitimacy fails, when people think the state is screwing up and needs to go in another direction. So populism isn't an ideology, it's a kind of a meta theory about democracy. And, but it's populist outbursts are kind of episodic, they're oriented toward particular kinds of problems, they're directed at change, and they're destabilizing by design. So you can see why the establishment doesn't like populism. It destabilizes whatever structures are there preventing problems from being solved. So the administrative state's response to this is the state outlasts the people in party politics and so forth, and is the true stabilizer and change agent. So for the administrative state, democracy is just a show. Okay, so I'll close there, but I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this. Yeah, sure.
I'm absolutely stunned by this presentation. I think I live in a different world because I come from Australia, and yesterday, the first time I've been with this tribe of people, I asked the room, did anybody know about complexity theory? Now, don't sociologists study it? I mean, nature has solved this problem of decision making in masses. You get millions of ants make the decisions where, and how to design and build their own homes. Thousands of bees do the same thing. Fish do the same thing. They have very simple rules from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And yesterday I was making a presentation that the whole paradigm of graduate schools is top down. And hierarchies, what you're talking about is the hierarchies can only manage complexity incompletely and inconsistently to create populism.
Yeah.
You've got to use, and the Austrian, Vincent and Eleanor Austrian have got the solutions. You've got to have bottom-up decision making. And don't sociologists study complexity theory, don't they study the Austrians and apply this to political science?
Yeah, so you know, there's this, obviously this sort of Austrian tradition of spontaneous organization and so forth. And it's surprisingly the case that American sociologists, in my experience, are completely blind to this. So I'll tell you.
That's what I'm so stunned about.
Yeah, well, it's true. So I had this, I was chair of the theory section of the ASA many, many years ago. And we had this meeting of the chairs of all of these sections with the ASA representatives to the sections. And they were issuing regulations for us as to when we could have our receptions. So they had this very complicated set of rules, and you had to abide by these rules. And I said, well, why not just let people do whatever they want, and they'll discover what a good time to do it or a bad time to do it is, and then you would have order and everybody would be satisfied, rather than have a situation where some people get their schedule when a time that's inappropriate for them, and so on and so forth. And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. That it was just completely outside of their conception of how the world works, that people would make self-interested decisions that would result in order that would actually be better than any order that you could impose by fiat. No, it was not their picture of the world.
So nobody teaches this stuff.
Well, I think they see this as right-wing ideology. They see it as part of sort of Austrian economics and intrinsically hostile to the idea of social reform, because it's not direct. For them, it's got to be directed in order to be effective.
No wisdom of the crowds.
Yeah.
I think one of the concepts that's lurking behind the presentation, which has to be made explicit, especially from a historical perspective, is not so much democracy or liberalism or administration, but a concept that was central to like the 19th and early 20th century American ideas, which was the concept of republic. And I think that, in other words, there's an intellectual history strand that was missing here that I think is important. The Wilson stuff is great, and the public administration, literature, totally right. There's another really strong literature coming out at the end of the Civil War in the United States, starting with people like Richard Ely, right? I mean, this is one of the great figures, beginning with the progressive movement, going through Dewey, Herbert Crawley. In England, you have a similar movement, right, with the British idealists, Bosanquet, all these, T.H. Green. And part of this idea is a reformulation of the concept that society, that liberalism, or what we understand as classical liberalism, is a failed theory of society. That, in effect, the reason that you need a bureaucracy, an administrative state, is because the wisdom of the crowd, whatever that means, people cannot handle the kind of technical problems that are emerging.
Right.
So from historically, the beginning of the administrative state in the United States occurs because of the end of the Civil War, and you have all these people who don't have legs and arms and need assistance, and we have to create an agency that's going to deal with this problem. We can't just leave it to society to handle it. And I'm wondering about this because it seems to me that the concept that Dewey lays out in The Public and Its Problems, this idea which is the same concept, is exactly the idea that democracy needs. Democracy, seems to me at least, needs to reclaim the concept of a bureaucracy that sees the things that happen in society as the property of the state, of the
people. Yeah.
And I see it like, I live in New York City, thank God. Thank God for every minuscule law. Because it would be a nightmare. In other words, like if one little tand, if I say like, I live in a co-op building, I want 5 dogs in my apartment, I don't care about anybody else. No, you can't do whatever you want. And that I think is the key to Pettit's idea of contestatory democracy and non-domination, because his theory of non-domination is arbitrary interference. So if you put it in the populist context then, it seems to me like neoliberalism is all about reshaping and reconstituting the administrative state for the interests of arbitrary power, capital. And I'm wondering how that fits into like what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so neoliberalism is just another expert project. So it falls completely within the ambit of the idea of the administrative state. It's administered. It's, you create markets and say energy and so forth, and you think that that's going to get you more optimal solutions than so forth. But it's still designed by administrators for administrative ends. So it's still the administrative state. So Pettit, Pettit's issue, or my issue with Pettit, is who actually does this regulating, and what is the basis for their regulating. So Pettit is enthralled by the idea that, well, there is all this expert knowledge out there. There is all of these people who can speak for the people, that can express the civic culture, but we just have to entrust to them the task of expressing civic culture. And at that point, I think maybe Wilson is on to something, and it's absolutely a problem with Pettit to figure out, well, okay, how about minorities that have a coherent conception of things that differs from the common knowledge?
But isn't that his idea of the contestatory aspect?
No, absolutely not. His problem is he can't figure out what to do with those people because you need a common ground for contestatory. What you're contesting is on the basis of common knowledge. That if the state goes wrong, there's this kind of common sense of what domination is and oppression is that corrects it. But what if there's no common sense? What if people disagree about what that is? So when he discusses this in the Republicanism books, he really struggles to figure out, well, what do you do about that? He says, well, maybe we have sort of separate rights for those people or something like that. but he can't get it into the ground of this common knowledge thing because it's not a common knowledge problem. So if you're looking at Wilson's problem, which is, okay, now we've got this incredible diversity, they're all going into the voting booth, horrors, there's not a good solution for Pettit because he has to deny that this diversity actually is morally relevant to the idea of a civic culture. So Wilson's really denying that there is a civic culture. He wants to say, well, there once was, it just doesn't exist anymore. And I think there's a good Kelsenian response to this, is that, yeah, and that's exactly why we have these majoritarian procedures. We take these problems that can't be resolved on the civic cultural level and put it into the electoral system and hope for the best. But you can't do anything better than that. And but Pettit thinks, yeah, you can do better than that. And you have to do better than that because the people really can't do the job. They're not expert enough, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Very thought-provoking and very inspiring. Thanks so much. I would like to refer to this outsourcing decision-making model. It's very interesting. To some extent, it reminds me quite a lot to this Auguste Comte old project of sociologists as leaders of society, and to some extent also to Plato's concept of philosopher as a ruler. It's a quite obvious parallelism to my view. However, the crucial point is who are these experts, according to Pettit, how to recruit them, and how to control them. Is, I think, one of the challenges that needs to be answered.
Yeah, so the question is this a challenge that can actually be solved, or is this an aporia in the system that you can drive a truck through? And that's, I think that's a matter of perception. So I think if you're, in the favored class, you think, oh, well, it's no problem. Just appoint our friends and everything is going to be fine. But if you're not in the favored class, you're going to just see that as a form of domination.
Thanks for bringing Wilson into the picture. I was thinking about he was one of the first students at Johns Hopkins, and so much of what he seemed to be drawing on was the German political science that would have been going on at the time. And what's interesting is the extent to which, when he's defining heterogeneous populations, I mean, he's talking about races and immigrants, and the fact that the southern races can't govern themselves and are corrupt, and so forth. But that probably has as much to do with the locations inside cities, where they're immigrating to cities where they don't have access to power because they don't have citizenship and so on. But what Wilson's solution seems to involve is a kind of, it seems to be suggesting that an expertise is possible to speak on behalf of some sort of common law. To me, it's ultimately Kantian republicanism, where in Kant talks about what we need to do is take the libertarian point of view, but we don't actually consult the public themselves. So we just imagine what the public wants, then implement it. And in Kant's idea, the experts would provide this autonomous criticism, but with this public administrative idea, it seems like the experts and the administrators are being conflated in that situation, and what they're not allowing for is a genuine criticism to enter, which is actually not Kant's idea. But this seems to be the evolution that takes place between Kant at, say, 1800 and 1870, when that interim stage is where they put the race and nationalism into that Republican idea, the original Kantian idea. So it strikes me that Wilson is introducing this public administrative class and so on, presuming a form of expertise, but not really accounting for where any counter expertise enters
Right.
the system.
No concept of that.
So
So I think what's interesting about this, and I've got another paper dealing with this, is the order of the argument. So rather than they're saying, look, there's this expertise here, we need to apply it to this situation. And create powerful people who can use that expertise. They start with the powerful people to use the expertise without there being any expertise. So the expertise is kind of an empty thing that is supposed to fill in this power vacuum, but it's not there. So they were much more concerned with finding models for governance than they were for actually collecting up this alleged expertise that would allow them to govern more effectively. And it's really interesting. Wilson's almost a minor player in this. One of the key figures is John Burgess, who was founder of the Columbia School of Politics and Economics. It became the Social Science School. And in exactly the same period, the 1870s, they're starting this school. It's sort of the next thing after Johns Hopkins. And their goal is to produce educated civil servants, because there aren't any. And the idea is that you create them to take these positions that will then be created for them to fill. And so their model, just like Wilson, and Wilson goes on at great length about this, that all the wisdom is Europe, we need to follow the Germans, blah, blah, blah. Burgess goes actually to Paris, and they look at the French administrative system as a model. And what they're trying to do is create these expert bureaucrats and to try to figure out what kind of education we need for these people. And the original social science education is, well, it's statistics in the 19th century Prussian state sense of just basic statistical knowledge, not hypothesis testing or anything like that. Knowledge of state mechanisms and bureaucracy, and some knowledge of economics, but it's sort of a state-directed kind of German national economics that they had in mind. And that was supposed to be, and that was the core of early Columbia social science. And Burgess was so fanatically pro-German that during the First World War, he lived quite a long time, he was considered sort of suspect as for his loyalty. And so to clear his name, he wrote a book critical of the Germans. And the book was so uncritical of the Germans that the post office, when it read it, banned it as German propaganda. So this guy never quite freed himself from his admiration for the Germans. But the German administrative state was the model that they really thought, hey, this is what we need, and let the rest of it take the hindmost. So.
Thanks, Stephen. That was extremely interesting and stimulating. One question I have for you is the application of the theory to contemporary populism, which you touched on at various points as you went through. And I think you said, I wasn't sure, were you attributing it to yourself or your own view, or were you attributing it to the certain kind of left and liberal opinion that the source of populism is failures of output, or perceived failures of output legitimacy for certain groups of people that leads to some regeneration of public consciousness and the idea that the public has wisdom, etc., etc. And I think that's probably partly true. If you look at contemporary right populism, as I observe it at least, that certainly the failure of output legitimacy is going to be a major stimulant to this type of populist mobilization. But I would say also, it's not only that, or maybe not even fundamentally that in certain respects. It's also a failure of input legitimacy, or at least we could say that output legitimacy, or we say falling living standards, is a problem, I can be expressed as a problem of input legitimacy. And one of the really interesting things about contemporary right in Europe, contemporary extreme right in Europe, is the degree to which they're engaging in kind of participatory democratic engagement with publics. They have elaborate websites, elaborate consultations, plebiscitary kind of referenda on issues and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it's tightly controlled at the centre. So the results of opinion are more or less pre-given by the way the agenda is set up and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, they're appealing to something like participatory involvement of publics, people generally, and one can take a lesson from that perhaps and ask the question, is the centrist liberal account of democracy, which really did centre on output legitimacy, said leave it to us, we'll deliver a good society, a good economy, expertise will rule, etc., etc. But in a sense, the judgment of publics today is this hasn't happened for us, for far too many of us. And so perhaps one could infer from that the failure then of this kind of centrist, including left centrist kind of views, was that they were too complacent about the input legitimacy of democracy. That from the period to the 60s to the 90s, or to the 2000s, there was very considerable movements or ideas about participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, public inclusion, some of the stuff Penn says, but much others as well, mediation processes, public consultation, etc., etc. But nobody ever thought that necessary to bring all that together into a different model of politics. And so that the contemporary centrist solution seems to have been inadequate, and the extreme right can come in and take over the space in the populistic kind of perversion of the original intentions of participation.
Now, I think that's a good point, because what usually happens with populist initiatives, and this includes the left ones, like the Occupy movement, is that they get absorbed, and the Greens, in a bizarre way, are a form of populism. They get absorbed by the existing political parties, or by somebody who will actually bring it into the political arena. So the history of almost all of these populist issues is they win because somebody takes it up. So it transforms but you're bringing up a point about transforming the actual processes themselves, which is really interesting, because in the sort of classic form of this, the American People's Party, they were also concerned with that kind of process. They wanted to deal with lobbyists and stuff like that, and they didn't really get their way on those process things. I think process is very hard to change. Participatory democracy and so forth, they're great ideas, they're very difficult to institutionalize. So whatever institution you get has its limitations and generates its own power constellations, and they then get committed to their own survival and lose touch with the desires of the people, and then you get another sort of populist revolt, or another kind of dissatisfaction that somebody eventually absorbs. Hopefully they absorb, or else we have really a revolutionary situation where you've got a non-legitimate state and people with a strong sense that they're being had by the state.
I really like I like the talk a great deal, and it's so interesting to me that the sort of Weberian, Schmittian, Kelsen divides the world up so differently, instead of the separation of powers that we have in our sort of legislative, judicial, and the executive, to really separate out a separate conception of the bureaucratic state that seems so important, and something we often forget about. Weber's ambivalence towards it, and Schmidt as well. You said Kelsen, you quoted him as saying, if majorities rule, they won't oppress themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
overly optimistic.
Yeah, I was going to say that is so demonstrably
Yeah.
untrue, because I would say almost that, populism tends to be self-defeating. That would be my argument, at least. You mentioned the Occupy movement, and we haven't really introduced capital into this at all. So in a world in which power as such isn't actually anchored in an administrative state or voting or anything else these days, but actually that there's a separate base, we can argue how important it is, that's in capital itself. How does this Schmittian, Kelsian analysis
Yeah.
play out, because there is something strong that the people are weak in relation to.
Yeah, I think both of them would say, and actually it's also in the populist literature, is that, you know, the power of capital depends on the way it's regulated by the state, and you know, they don't acknowledge any limits in principle as to what democracies might decide to do about that